So, Maoism.
Happiest evening of our lives, singing to our heart's content songs in praise of Chairman Mao.
What even is it? I mean, of course we know who Mao Zedong is. We've been taught this in school. He was an authoritarian communist dictator of China who killed millions. But yet, there's more. I mean, that's the extent that I thought of him for all these years, without even realizing the profound influence he's had on the modern world. This is Maoism. Okay, but before we talk about Mao and his reign, we need some contextualization, because I mean, who doesn't like some good old contextualization? China in the 1900s was just a cell of its former self. What used to be the Middle Kingdom, a literal economic superpower never even rivaled to this day, was scarred by corruption, weak rulers, and most importantly, a desire to change. I mean, it got so bad that the Qing dynasty was just getting exploited by imperial powers. Even Japan, China's little brother, joined in on this with Japanese imperialism and the Sino-Japanese Wars. And when the Qing dynasty finally realized that yes, this was a problem and decided to fight back against the imperial powers just marched right into the imperial palace and held a military period there in an event known as the Boxer Rebellion, just as so they could. Needless to say, the Qing dynasty was doomed. When the Qing dynasty collapsed, the Republic of China was formed, which brought about two parties, the Kuomintang, which were basically the nationalists, and the communists. Originally, these two parties worked together to unite China, as after the Qing dynasty, China experienced a warlord period, with land being divided between warlords. However, they slowly wanted more and more influence, and eventually a civil war broke out for who would have ultimate control of China. Now, the Kuomintang were in the vast majority, and were heavily favored to win the war. They even pushed the communists to the brink of defeat in 1934, where they surrounded them. This forced the communists to retreat through terrainous terrain into northwest China in what is the relatively famous event known as the Long March. And this is where a young, ambitious leader showcased himself to the people. Mao Zedong was an ambitious young man who had devoted himself to communism and the spreading of it in China. He was born of relatively wealthy parents and embraced the works of Karl Marx, as he thought it was only right that everybody should have their basic needs met. And let me tell you, he wouldn't stop at the hands of the Kuomintang.
Their leader was Mao Zedong. His aim? To make a united Red China.
To win, he decided to initiate the first principle of Maoism, protracted people's war. This is a military strategy, which is kind of guerrilla warfare, kind of not. Let me just explain. So basically, if you're a group of small ragtag revolutionaries, would you go up against the government with their state-of-the-art army and technology that could easily decimate you? Of course not. You'd first want to build an army so you could actually stand a chance. Mao thought that in order to establish an army, you'd first need a revolutionary base, which would preferably be in mountainous or other treacherous terrain, so you wouldn't get invaded. Once you've established this, you build more revolutionary bases and spread your influence throughout the country. And finally, there's stage 3, where your army becomes so big that it can take small cities and progressively move on to larger ones, until finally, you could even take over the whole entire country. And this is exactly what Mao did. He would move from village to village, spreading the good news of communism and how it would save everybody's lives. And while the villagers, they believed him and joined his army. Now, casualties didn't even matter to Mao anymore, since he could just go on over to the next village and persuade the villagers to join his army. Okay, let's just take a quick break from the story, because there's something really cool that I found while researching this topic.
Mao knows that to win, he must rely on deserters from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army.
Mao also had a plan for world domination of communism, and it actually wasn't that bad. He believed in Third Worldism, which states that for communism to become a worldwide ideology, it first needs to develop in third world countries. The reasoning for this is because first world countries rely on third world countries to make goods for them. You know, think sweatshops in places such as China, Thailand, Vietnam, those types of places. These workers make it possible for the bourgeoisie and proletariat in first world countries to work in tandem, while the bourgeoisie is exploiting the less important third world proletariat. If the third world countries have a revolution and move to communism, then the bourgeoisie can't exploit them anymore. The bourgeoisie would then have to exploit the proletariat of first world countries, which would break up the tandem they had and spark a revolution in first world countries as well. Now, obviously, this did not work, because is the United States of America communist? No. Although the principles to set this in motion are there, it still needs to be executed, which is seemingly difficult in communist societies. Also, this was just an idea that Mao held, and many current-day Maoists renounce this idea and completely disagree with it. Okay, now, back to the story. The charisma and leadership Mao showed proved for one of the greatest comebacks in history, and in 1949, after a brief intervention to fight off the Japanese in World War II, the communists prevailed and established the People's Republic of China, with none other than Mao Zedong as their leader.
周恩来、宋庆龄等党和国家领导人，随着他们的脚步，我们的民族也登上了一个崭新的高度。
Remember what I said earlier about China's economy? Well, it was down bad. The situation was nearly the same that it was 50 years ago, and they were still an agrarian feudalist society instead of the sad industrial capitalist one. There had to be something new in order for China to succeed, and this is where the second of Maoism's principles comes in: new democracy. New democracy is very self-evident with there being, well, a new democracy. Now, of course, the ultimate goal of the People's Republic of China was to bring communism into China, but in order to do that, they'd first need to undergo the process of capitalism. Think about it this way: economic systems have adjusted according to the needs of humans. First, there were hunter-gatherer societies, but once humans found out how to plant food, they turned to farming societies. They then realized they could exploit humans for labor and get rich from it, so they moved to slave societies. When there were no need for slaves anymore, they moved to feudalism. When the Industrial Revolution took place, and there's all of a sudden no need for that many humans to plant crops, they moved to capitalism. And then the next logical steps would be to go to socialism and then to communism. And I mean, you can't skip steps in the process. They have to be done in order, just like what happened with the Soviet Union. Now, Mao's plan was to have both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat work together to overthrow imperialism, because they believed that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism. Then, the bourgeoisie would develop industry under the proletariat's watch to make sure they never went out of line. And once all the industry had been developed, the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, since there would be no need for them anymore. And now, once all this had been done and industry had been developed, then you could finally move to a socialist state. As you could expect, this was all highly regulated and just basically modified capitalism. Some of you may think that this is kind of contradictory because you're bringing in the very thing that you want to defeat, but this was a necessary evil. Think about it in terms of antibodies. The antibody protein combines with the disease that is making you feel ill, but over time, it fights off the disease and makes you feel better. And all this would be incorporated using the third principle of Maoism, the mass line. You can't build a society without people. People are the structure that are holding up your society, and therefore have more power than the rulers. Rulers are only representatives of the people and put their will to action. So what the mass line set out to do was to bring the people and their opinions into the equation. There'd be basically what is an equivalent to a suggestion box, where people could voice their ideas, concerns, disagreements with the government, and the government would listen to them. The government would then implement those ideas, and the people would proceed to critique the implementation of those ideas. This fine-tuning would go on until the policy was basically perfect, and there was no need for the government anymore, aka communism. Probably the most notable implementation of this principle was the 100 Flowers campaign. In this campaign, the government urged its citizens to give their opinions on the government and its leaders. However, it turned out people really didn't like the government, and the campaign ended after a year. And this led to the anti-rightist campaign, where Mao identified those who spoke out against him and the government, and labeled them as rightists or revolutionaries, and killed around 1 million of them. All this was done in hopes of boosting China's economy, because as you all know, it was down pretty bad. So they decided to incorporate a series of 5-year plans, which were basically identical to the Soviet Union's. These centralized basically everything, inputs, outputs, allocation of resources, those types of things. Like, for example, if you're a farmer, then the land and tools that you work with aren't yours, but rather owned by the government. And the food that you produce, yeah, that isn't yours either. You'd have to give it to the government so that the more important people would have food to survive. And you could probably guess how popular this turned out to be. Although there are still some private industries at this time, China offered to buy them out for prestigious government jobs, and this was just kind of symbolic. It was either you take our offer or get labeled as a class enemy and die. In the early days, Mao actually did quite well. He gave everyone free healthcare, as it was very difficult to get medical treatment back then, and started to industrialize China. Even the Soviets came in to help industrialize China, because they needed all the friends they could get at that time. And the results showed. As you could expect, China's economy started to boom once they welcomed heavy industrialization, and they reaped the rewards of their new productive capacity. However, there is still a lot of work to be done, as they still relied on manpower in the agricultural sector, which is detrimental considering the size of their population. An imbalance in the output of food and the population, lack of efficiency, and flexibility made China think that the Soviet way of things just wasn't for them. Although they didn't completely abandon the system, as they still kept the centralization of industry and kept the name for future implementations of the plan, they now started to focus more so on the provincial level. Now, they'd look at each province specifically and decide which industry would be best suited for it. Like, for example, they'd say this province is good for farming, and this province is good for mining. It was also a great leap forward in military, agriculture, and farming. This plan was the Great Leap Forward.
In January 1958, Mao boldly announced China's second five-year plan. An economic and humanitarian disaster was unfolding. An estimated 30 to 50 million people died of starvation in the Great Chinese Famine.
The Great Leap Forward was more like a huge step back. This plan wanted to dramatically increase the output of industrial sectors, but in order to do this, it needed to increase the output of agricultural sectors. And how do you think they expected to do this? Well, they just told the population to work harder. Yeah, you heard me right. They really just said work harder. However, this point wasn't without any merit. You see, the higher-ups believed that the Chinese workers weren't performing to their fullest potentials. They believed the workers were lazy, and if they just worked harder, then they could dramatically increase the output of agricultural sectors. However, they only worked the bare minimum because of the system they were in. Similar to the Soviet Union, if they outperformed their peers, then they were labeled as an enemy of the state. Mao also wanted to industrialize the agricultural sector, which is actually a very good idea. But to do this, you need steel. And where do you get steel from? From farmers, of course. Mao encouraged farmers to set up backyard furnaces. Yes, I repeat, the same nation who 1,000 years ago were masters of steelmaking were now having farmers make steels in their backyard. And a lot of people flocked to this profession because the reward for doing this was very lucrative and much better than farming. However, if you have people who don't know how to make steel, and you all of a sudden tell them to make steel, well, they're not going to make very good steel. The steel they made was basically unusable, because what do you expect? They never made steel before. In addition, Mao put great emphasis on grain, which is fine and all, but when winter came, people had nothing to eat but bread. And you can't only survive off bread in the winter months. In addition, Mao expected an unreasonable amount of crops, which led to mass misreporting of how many crops there were, as farmers didn't want to die. And while all this was going on, China was still exporting its crops to other nations, while its own nation was starving. Due to the poor management of crops, loss of farmers to the backyard furnaces, lots of natural disasters and droughts, and a lack of industrialization in this sector, a huge famine broke out, which killed around 20 to 50 million people. And to put that number into perspective, that was around 5% of their total population. Yeah, as you can see, famine is a kind of recurring issue in communist societies. After this, there wasn't that much of notoriety. Mao had to step down as chairman of the Communist Party, but he still had a lot of power behind the scenes, and he appointed Li Shaoqiu, who was a more moderate communist. Now, their plan was to just reconstruct the economy in a plan titled Agriculture First. This plan basically just tried to fix what Mao did by increasing the output of the agricultural sector so they could actually meet the demands of the people. However, after about 5 years of this, a revolution broke out. It all started with a swim. Mao was starting to get old during this time, and support for him was weakening. People didn't see him anymore as the strong revolutionary who brought them to victory and gave everyone free healthcare, but rather as an old, frail, radical communist who didn't care about his people. He needed to cement his place in Chinese communism as the man, the myth, the legend, Mao Zedong. So he started his final revolution in the fourth pillar of Maoism, the Cultural Revolution. Mao had a reputation of being a strong swimmer, and used to go on swims in the Yangtze River to showcase his power. These swims served as a symbol of his ideology, like how he wasn't afraid of US imperialism. In 1966, an aging Mao would go on a highly publicized stage swim, which was meant to dispel any rumors of his deteriorating health and that he was still the same strong dictator they used to know him as. State-run media reported that he swam 15 kilometers, which is a little over 9 miles, in 65 minutes, which would smash any current day world record. And you know what? I completely believe that. I mean, Mao's just built different. This revolution glorified Mao as basically a god, and his teachings became the status quo. Mao wanted to become chairman of the Communist Party, even after his disastrous campaigns. So he labeled those campaigns as the doings of the bourgeoisie who infiltrated the party, and he called on the proletariat to have another revolution, which would get rid of the bourgeoisie who were in the party. And just like with the Soviet Union, anybody who disagreed with Mao was killed, but this time with a new group. Mao saw just how impressionable college students were and how they were a great catalyst for revolution, so he advanced a lot of his propaganda toward the college students and created the Red Guard, which was made up of mostly college students. The Red Guard were tasked with destroying the four olds: old culture, old tradition, old ideology, and old customs, through any means necessary. They were incredibly violent, and if you got lucky, they only reported you to the police. But more commonly, they tortured, humiliated, or even killed you. They were even expected to kill professors who spoke out against Mao, just to show an example of what would happen if he didn't agree with Mao or his ideology. But probably the epitome of the Cultural Revolution came in the Little Red Book. This book was a compilation of the cultural and political teachings of Mao Zedong. The government urged its citizens to read it every day for guidance and inspiration, and the super committed communists would carry it around everywhere they went, so they'd always be ready to consult and inspire. This book, of course, furthered the cult of personality of Mao Zedong, but perhaps more importantly, it helped indoctrinate his ideology throughout the nation. Now, Mao was rewriting history in his own name through the Red Guard, and by forcing people to comply with his ideology on stuff such as how to be a good citizen, communism, women, culture, and others of that sort. The Cultural Revolution got so bad that when the Prime Minister of Pakistan came to visit, he gave Mao 40 mangoes. Since Mao couldn't possibly eat 40 mangoes, and they were considered a rare delicacy, he gave them to his subordinates, and some of them got in the hands of factory workers. When they ate it, they were mesmerized by its taste and started worshipping the fruit. They believed mangoes were a symbol of Mao and the prosperity he would bring them. The mango then became this magical fruit which everybody worshipped, and at one point, if you didn't worship the mango, then you were considered an enemy of the state. Even though the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution was officially disbanded by 1969, the Cultural Revolution is believed to have continued until Mao's death in 1976. This revolution did exactly what it set out to accomplish. It built a cult of personality around Mao Zedong and rewrote history in his name, with only around 1 million dead. Man, all these statements are so contradictory. Mao presented himself as a god who could do no wrong, but yet he killed millions of people just to test out his own version of communism. Speaking of contradictions, This brings us to the fifth and final pillar of Maoism, the law of contradictions. Okay, it's time to get a bit philosophical, so get ready. Mao believed that every being had an essence, which is the way they look on the outside, and a being, which is the way they are on the inside. It's sort of like how you can't tell the difference between Honey Nut Cheerios and regular Cheerios before you actually taste them. Well, this creates contradictions in the being. It's kind of like how on the inside you really want to be productive, but on the outside you're too lazy and just want to spend your whole entire day on your phone. These contradictions create unity, like when you finally decide on the inside and on the outside that yes, you are going to do something productive, so you go do something productive. This unity creates even more contradictions, and the cycle keeps going on forever and ever. Now, apply this to a social standpoint. There's contradictions in the capitalist system between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Due to that contradiction, a revolution breaks out, and the proletariat seizes power. That unity creates even more contradictions, and let's say it hypothetically gets solved through another revolution. This would continue until communism would be developed, and there'd be no more contradictions. Now, of course, there'd still be contradictions among the people, because that's unavoidable, but there wouldn't be any more class contradictions. Okay, that was a lot to take in. Who knew that this ragtag leader would lead the Communist Party and take control of China while altering this entire nation as we know it? After Mao's death, China basically abandoned its goal of communism, with each leader straying further and further away from it. Which leads us to the present day, where China brands itself as communist, but in all actuality is capitalist, and you can see just how well it's doing for itself. Many people still revere Mao Zedong in China, even after all his shortcomings. He was a revolutionary who kind of modernized his nation and set up the prototype for what would eventually become modern-day China. Although he did stuff for the greater good, which most of the time didn't work, people still remember him as this great leader who modernized and unified China because of his cult of personality. Was he a great person who brought much needed change to China, or just a psychopath who only saw people as pawns in his own game? That is up for you to decide. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay thinking.